Humans and gaming go back thousands of years, and with it came the history of game controllers. Traditionally, this manifested itself as which stick had the pointiest end to play poke the nonce with, or which chess set had the most curvaceous queen. But by the 1970s, we began to see the rise of the home video game system, and with it, the very first video game controllers. If you've only ever grown up with the modern two-handle, two-joystick sensibilities that have served us faithfully for the last 20 years, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that's just how it's always been. But the first 30 years of home game systems were a completely uncharted territory, full of wood paneling, horrible ergonomics, and ambitious pioneers. This is the history of retro gaming controllers. The Magnavox Odyssey was the first commercially available home game console and was sculpted by the finest disco artisans of the 1970s to be shaped like a gaming mecca, the roof of a Pizza Hut.
While people who want television to do their thing entertain themselves with Odyssey.
With easy plug-and-play features, such as a screwdriver to wire it into the back of your TV. The Magnavox Odyssey is powered by an affordable 6 huge fuck-off batteries. This beautiful half-console, half-board game brick sold for around $600 in 2020 beans and came with 12 games. Sort of. The only thing it was capable of rendering were 3 dots and a vertical line on the screen, but give them a break. It was the 70s, they hadn't even heard of jiggle physics yet. Instead, the console was bundled with plastic overlays that you put over your TV that alter whatever cartridge you put in. Now the controller isn't great, but hey, they had to start somewhere. This ergonomic cinder block being penetrated by a logger salami had 2 knobs on it that made your square go up or down, left or right, as well as a
Special English control which fits inside the horizontal knob will make that tennis ball do everything but stand up and talk.
Sorry, what?
Make that tennis ball do everything but stand up and talk.
Okay, it's just a knob for cheating. Sweet. The only button on the controller was a reset button, which really exemplified the caveman era of gaming. Up, down, left, right, win, reset. Look at this dashboard looking ass console. It's called the Fairchild Channel F. Guess what the F stands for? It stands for fun, a 3-letter word. Did you really need to shorten that? The Channel Fudge is arguably the best console to find yourself with when stranded on an island, as the wood paneling is just enough kindling to start a small fire. This BBC of a console sold for $169 USD in 1976. That's around $760 in modern greens. Those are some awfully big numbers for something with 64 bytes of RAM and the ability to render nothing but this beautiful color palette. Don't worry, someone didn't leave a pair of their favorite black cheese graters next to this picture. Those are actually the controllers. You're meant to hold the long part in your palm and then fiddle the knob at the end with your thumb, because it's like a penis. The knobbly bit could either be pointed in 8 directions with your thumb or twisted for the now inevitable pong. It also had bop it functionality for shooting and pull it functionality for pulling. While they look more like a lightsaber flashlight than a game controller, they were definitely a big leap to what we know today, especially compared to the Magnavox's napkin dispenser of a controller.
Hey stranger, what's your favorite game? I've got invaders in my sights and I'm taking aim.
Alright, now we're getting to the good shit. The Atari 2600 is iconic and absolutely smoked the competition, selling 30 million units, 10 times more than the second place Intellivision, which sold 3 million. What a beautiful fucking console, man. What an aesthetic. If Fairchild Channel Fergalicious had car dashboard energy, the Atari 2600 had sports car dashboard energy. That powerful 80s block font, that tasteful wood paneling, and those 4 knobs like Tuesday afternoon in your mum's bedroom. The Atari 2600 was also known as the Atari VCS, short for Video Computer System, because the 80s liked to name things the same way Soviet Russia made buildings. You know how your mum just calls any game a Nintendo, regardless of what console it's actually on? The Atari 2600 was so successful that the word Atari was used in the same way, used to describe both the console and video games in general.
The controller is equally iconic, and while it is still nowhere near as ergonomic as contemporary controllers, unlike the previous consoles, it is very obvious what it does. Stick goes wiggle, button goes press, easy. A few of the buttons and switches were delegated to the console itself, such as the difficulty settings and a reset button. The lads over at Atari bundled 2 of these suckers with the console, so you could play with a friend straight out of the box.
Of course, they bloody better throw in an extra controller, because the 2600 may as well have been how much it cost, rolling in at a steamy $840 in modern munds. That's like $50 for every pixel on screen.
The 2600 had a number of controller variants over its lifetime that ranged from the fairly reasonable paddle controller, which uses the fun of adjusting a thermostat to make games like Pong easier to control, to the bizarre keyboard controller, which uses the fun of a phone that can't make calls to control games like Star Raiders.
Of course, none of these even come close to the insanity that was the Atari MindLink. The MindLink was a prototype motion controller, unfortunately cancelled early in development, that, and I quote, measures the movement of the user's eyebrows via a fitted headband. It was most likely cancelled due to the fact that users in testing would frequently get headaches from having to constantly move their eyebrows in order to play.
What's up, game fuckers? Love Memby Kubos and hate money? Consider showing off both these alpha traits by joining my Patreon and getting videos 2 days early, 2 days late, or whatever, extended videos with all the foreskin jokes that don't make the cut, and commentary where I talk over my stupid videos and make them even more obnoxious. Thanks.
Want to know why the Atari 2600 sold over 10 times as many units as the console in second place? Well, once you see it, it's no wonder why. No, I know. It's also to do with the library of games and marketing and price. The Intellivision launching for a whopping $1,060. But come on, look at this thing.
I suppose they were keen to build off the familiarity of the telephone, forgetting that people don't actually play games on their phone. Well, not for a couple more decades anyway. True pioneers, the people over at Mattel Electronics were, that they included buttons on both the left and right sides of the controller that do the same thing, but were placed on both sides in case you were either right or left-handed. The silver medallion at the bottom, a perfect metaphor for its second place standing in the console war, was a sort of iPod wheel ahead of its time, except you were meant to use it to push in 16 unique and exciting directions.
Wow!
The one unique feature that is kinda cool is that each game came with a unique plastic overlay that you slot into the phone pad bit, which replaces the stupid number pad buttons with what the buttons actually do in the game. Of course, if you lose them, good luck finding replacements, because it's not that you could just look it up on the internet. Intellivision, more like block your vision with my fucking balls.
What's it like to play the Nintendo Entertainment System?
This is it. This is the one.
Hey, so you knew earlier how the Atari 2600 absolutely creamed the competition? Well, it's likely Atari would have continued to do so had they not spent too much money on an ET game and crashed the entire Western games market. Woo!
Of course, we can't all blame E.T., but I wish we could. God, I hate his fucking stupid, disgusting puppet face. Whatever the reason, Nintendo was able to ride in and absolutely dominate the market with the Nintendo Entertainment System, an iconic piece of hardware that gave birth to many of Nintendo's beloved franchises that are still going to this day. I'm talking Zelda, I'm talking Mario, I'm talking Aussie Rules Footy. Aside from some fantastic games, look at that controller. Sure, they hadn't quite yet figured out that human hands and sharp edges go together like milk and tomato sauce, but really, this is the blueprint that all controllers are built on to this day. Movement on the left, buttons on the right, and the stuffy 9 to 5 buttons in the middle that don't do anything exciting, but put in the hard yards to make your games more playable.
Nintendo decided that you couldn't be trusted with the 16-directional keypad that consoles like the Intellivision utilized because, I mean, the games look like this. How many directions did you really need to go?
The NES was a nice middle ground between the single-button hyper-simplicity of the Atari 2600 and the fat guy loading up at the button buffet that was the Intellivision controller, allowing game designers to add some extra functionality to their games without it being overwhelming.
The Master System was the silver medalist of the third console generation and is so boring that it hardly warrants mention. The controller, I mean, some of the games were kind of fun.
The early console generations were so fixated on random numbers that meant little in the way of actual use and gameplay, but if you could tell someone that one system had more bits and bytes in it, your average Joseph would go, well shit, I could use more bits, even though nobody then or now knows what the heck a bit even is. This probably translated over to the controller, as they seem desperate to show off how you can move in 8 unique directions with all of these arrows and designs pointing in every which way. Of course, the NES could do that too. They were just a bit cooler about it. In a brutal culling, the start and select buttons were removed, and while the start button was sort of integrated into the one button, the select button went missing entirely, and there is still a small cash reward for any information that leads to its whereabouts.
3 years after the Master System, enough time to have 2.8 babies if you don't mess around, Sega released its next console, the Sega Genesis. Both the Sega Genesis and its main rival, the Super Nintendo, were named after a Biggie Smalls lyric following his death, as a sign of respect for the fallen rapper.
Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis.
This was also the origin of the Atari, "Give me the loot!" Fucking stupid joke.
The Genesis controller was like the intermediary part of evolution, where the fish grow legs and walk onto land, as it appears to be halfway between the sharp, blocky Master System and NES controllers and the sort of sleek, palm-friendly controllers we know and love. Originally released with 3, play buttons? Whatever you want to call the buttons that actually do something. It had 3 of those and a start button. In 1993, they released a second controller that had some extra buttons, but not enough that you would get confused in the dark and try to call Pizza Hut on them.
This was primarily used for fighting games, which is one of those weird things that went the way of the dodo. Can you imagine having to buy a special controller just to be able to play fighting games better? The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, first popularized by some of JonTron's earlier videos, was Nintendo's answer to the Sega Genesis.
The SNES had an uphill battle to face, having released a few years after the Genesis had already secured a solid foothold in the US through some tactical marketing that angled the Genesis as the cooler alternative to Nintendo's products. According to a focus group performed by Sony, teenage boys wouldn't admit to owning a SNES over a Genesis.
Fellas, is it gay to own a SNES?
This was one of the first instances of the term console war being used, and the rivalry helped propel gaming even further into the mainstream.
Now, let's talk about the controller. Spicy.
While the Genesis's overall shape was closer to the sort of controllers we use today, you can't deny that the SNES is just a very nicely designed controller. For an example of this same concept but done poorly, feast your eyes on 1994's Neo Geo CD. Or how about the 1995 Super A-Can? These look like the controllers TV shows use when they need a generic video game to be played in the background of a crime drama by an actor who clearly doesn't know how video games work. Meanwhile, the SNES's A, B, X, Y layout is still the standard to this day, and it was one of the first controllers to incorporate a pair of shoulder buttons for exciting prostate exam action. Oh, and hey, Select is back. I missed that guy, even though I still don't really know what it does.
Okay, so technically we skipped over Sega's previous console, the Sega Saturn, but it was pretty much just an edgier version of the Genesis controller with a couple of shoulder buttons on top. It also came in third place, and we don't have time for losers here. Moving on to the Dreamcast, which came in fourth place. Wait. The Dreamcast was ahead of its time in many respects, being the first console to have the ability to play games over the beepity-boopity dial-up internet, and even having this weird little baby Dreamcast that plugged into the controller, called the VMU. The VMU acted as a memory card, a screen that could display extra information, such as health and ammo, and even its own portable game system, where you could remove it and play a mini-game that you had uploaded to it from the main game that you played. This allowed you to do things such as transfer a Chow Egg over from Sonic Adventure,
raise it on your VMU like a Tamagotchi, and then upload it back into the Dreamcast, or even plug two VMUs together to trade files or play games against one another.
I'll be honest, being able to take a small part of a game you're currently playing and fiddle around with it while you're at work or school is actually cool as hell, and it's something I've really only seen in like one-off peripherals, like that Pokeball thing that people like Chris Chan use, or the occasional mobile tie-in app.
It's a shame then, because the rest of the actual controller kinda sucks. As IGN noted at the time, its square shape forces your hands to bend into an uncomfortable parallel position. Also, this is petty and more based on the conventions of controllers that came after it, but the colour layout on the Dreamcast buttons also seems off. A red A and a blue B?
What's next? You're gonna lose the select button again? Oh, you did.
And now, the conclusion.
By the 2000s, the basic framework was set in stone. No longer were people trying to make controllers that resembled telephones or oven knobs or dialysis machines, and instead the rugged frontiersmen who had paved the way for this explosively popular industry had established conventions that are still used to this day. Empires had risen and fallen. The Intellivision did whatever it did. And the stage was set for the big three to stand in a triangle and take turns sack-tapping each other for the rest of eternity. You want to hear the stories behind those controllers? Well, you're just going to have to wait for next time. Good night, sleepyheads.
Over the last month, I held the Mini Kudos video game controller tournament, where all of my salacious subscribers could vote for which game controller would be crowned top dog. After a few intense weeks, it all came down to the GameCube versus the PlayStation 4. And the winner was the PlayStation 4. I knew I should have fudged the results. Thanks to everyone who got involved. Here are a few of my favourite comments. Never had either console, but the N64 has a giant penis. Anyone that chooses the Wii U controller needs their hard drive checked. It's easier to flatten your dick with the Dreamcast. I don't know. GameCube, because I feel like I'm rubbing a goblin's feet while playing. Did the Wii U even have a controller? From what I recall, it was just a brick with nipples. It's a great description, I might use that. Big thanks to everyone who got involved. I'd like to give a special shout out to my $10 patrons. Ryan the filmmaker, keep making those films, Ryan, you're doing a great job. Sergio Palsis, I'm really sorry if I got your name wrong there, but you're still my pal, sis. Tabor TCU, one of the best repositories for information about YouTube. Tom Videoga, whew, what a great guy. Thanks for the money, boys.